I'm definitely a nerd, so you will find me at every meetup, every evening. I'm at some meetup or the other. So if you see me in a lot of meetups, yeah, that's why. I don't have a life. That's just me. Apart from tech, I have a lot of different passions. Healthy living. I dream of traveling Europe in a camper van someday. I dream of settling down in Himalayas someday. Yeah. So a lot of different things. We can chat about that later. But I digress. So coming back to React context, let's jump right in. So this is your typical React component tree, I would say. So let's just analyze this, right? Let's just go through this and see what's happening here. So we have a page component, which is taking in a user and avatar size prop, and which in turn renders page layout, and it's just cascading those props through, and which in turn renders navigation bar and passing the props through. And then you have a link component, and finally you have a really nested avatar component, which is actually using those two props to render something, right? So this is pretty normal in React world, I would say, right? Because this is how React works. You pass props down, from parent to child. That is how it works, parent to child, and that's how you pass data around. So this is pretty normal, but the only iffy thing I would say is there are so many intermediary components that are passing data through, but they're not actually doing anything with it. So they're like messenger components in a way. So that is a bit not cool. So another thing is refactoring is a little bit hard, don't you say? Don't you think so? Like, this is a very simple example. Let's just extrapolate this to a real world component tree that you would see in a enterprise application. You would have like 15 props at least, don't you think so? And let's say you're cascading all of those props like to n level deep, and then you have to refactor one of those components. Nightmare. How many of you been there, done that, and then realized, oh my god, I forgot some prop or something is messed up and wasted a lot of time there, yeah. So, how do we solve this problem? This is not convenient. So, yeah, so this is the problem we discussed. Refactoring is hard and React has prop messages. And so Ken Dodds is a really popular developer in the JavaScript community. Shout out to him. So he named this problem as prop drilling. So it's just cooler and easier to just refer to this whole problem as prop drilling. So let's use that fancy cool term going forward. So how do we solve this problem, right? So any guesses? Yeah, I mean, we could use context. The talk is about context, yeah, but hold your horses, my friend. I would say the first approach that we would have to consider is component composition. So that's the simplest approach, right? Which has been around from like the early days of React, from the very beginning. And so let's just apply that and see how that goes. All right, so this is the refactored component using component composition. So we have the same page component. So what we have ended up doing is we are passing the entire link and avatar component as a prop, rather than passing the individual props that the avatar component needs. We are passing the component itself down as a prop. So you may ask, okay, we are still passing a prop down called user link. So how does this solve the problem? But the point is, you're passing one prop versus 10 to 15 props individually, which the component might need. So yeah, because the example is simple, maybe the point is not obvious, but we do need to use our imagination a little bit. So yeah, so that's the point. So it does solve the problem, right? Because you are passing only one again versus so many others. So is this the end of the task? So we don't need context? Is that the decision that we are coming to? No, right? We have context for a reason. So the problem here is we are only dealing with local data, I would say, which is like pertaining to only one sub-component tree. This is not global data, right? So let's say let's take the example of the size prop, right? The image size that we are passing to the avatar component. So that is required by one component in one particular subtree of React once. So that can be considered as a local prop data that is required. So for that particular problem, we are using composition as a solution, which works. Let's just extrapolate this and see what happens if we need like multiple children. We can use the same approach. We can pass 2 props instead of 1. And what happens if we, alright, so what happens if we really want to use it as a mechanism for sharing global data, right? That's the point. So that's where React Context comes into picture. So it's for sharing data across the component tree, like what is the current user, what is the theme that we are looking at, what is the locale. So these are props that you need to propagate across your component tree to various levels, to various different components. So that is where Context API is really good. So we have looked at the definition. Let's just move on to the evolution of Context API. So this was a little bit confusing when I was learning about it myself. I found it a little tricky because there's been a lot of different revisions that I've gone through. So initially React released the legacy API, which was like, if you had looked at the old docs, they were all in red saying, do not use, this is unstable, do not use this. Yeah, so I didn't. And then came the new stable API, which was released as part of 16.3. So you had the provider and the consumer and the good stuff. And then in 16.6, they released something called a new API called context type for the class components. So it was basically based off of feedback that the community gave because they felt that using provider consumer in a class component was a little using render props along with provider consumer for a class component was a little tricky. So they wanted context type. So we'll look at what they are in the coming slides. And then we got hooks. Hooks was awesome. So in 16.8, we got use context hook, which really simplified things for functional components. All right, we'll dive into what each of these are if they don't make sense right now. Please bear with me. All right. So an overview of the syntax of Context API. So what does Context API comprise of? It has like 3 sections. So the first, what you need to do is create a context itself. That is the first syntax that we see right here. And then we have something called a provider and a consumer. All right, so the APIs are named really well. So what provider does is actually it provides a value to a section of a React subtree. So that's why it's called a provider. And a consumer is a descendant, any descendant of that particular provider which wants to consume that value. So I feel React team has done a brilliant job in naming them. It just seems like common sense. So yeah. So the syntax is right here. So once you create a theme context using react.createContext, and this is the default value right here, which we have given as theme as dark. And then you would go ahead and create the provider using the context, the theme context that you have created, dot provider, and then pass the value. So this is the value that your React subtree is going to consume. And then whatever child components go through and consumer. All right. So for the consumer, this is the tricky part which I was talking about in the evolution. There is 2 different syntaxes depending on whether you're using a class component or using a function component. So if you're using a class component, so your consumer alone will differ. Your provider and your create context syntaxes are same across your class component and your function components. But if it's when it comes to the consumer alone, there is a difference. So let's look at what that is right here. So you would define a static context type equal to theme context. So you've already created your theme context in another file. You're exporting it from there and importing it here. And then you're assigning it to a static context type value. Once you do that, you would automatically get access to the whatever value that is being exposed by the provider using this dot context. So that is what you're receiving in value. So this is the syntax for context type right here, if it's a class component. let's look at what that is if it's a functional component. So in functional component, it's a lot more simpler, I would say, or it just, to me, it felt a lot more simpler because of the hooks concept. So all you got to do is just do react.use context of the theme context that you had already created. Yes?
Just a question, if you have multiple contexts in the class case, how do you deal with that? Previous one.
Here, yeah. So I think you would define multiple context types.
And then
You cannot compose it.
How would you have multiple these.context? How do you know that which context you're referring to?
Oh, right. I think there should be, I think it should take an array or something. Let me look that up.
Okay, sorry, just asking if you...
Yeah, sure. It's a good question. Let me look that up and get back to you. All right. So where were we? Yeah. So for functional component, we can use context, and there's a caveat here that we need to be aware of. Otherwise, it's gonna really have a performance issue in our app, and we'll realize it pretty late. So the main thing to note is when we are creating a provider, we are passing a value prop to it, and if there are multiple values, right? You create a new object and pass it as an object. If it's just a single value, of course, you're just going to pass the primitive value just as it is, and you don't have a problem there. But when you're passing multiple values here, you're passing it as an object, and every time it re-renders, it is going to create a new object. So, and how React figures out whether it has to re-render the provider is by checking whether the value prop is changing or not, right? Since you're creating a new object, it's going to do a basic just checking whether the memory addresses are same. When you create a new object, of course, it's going to have a new memory address, and it's not going to be equal. So it will re-render every time, and every time a provider re-renders, all of its consumers will re-render. So it's going to cost you in terms of performance, which is not ideal. So we have to fix this, right? So one of the initial solutions that was provided right when context was released was just add that object to state, and then pass this .state as a value to your provider. So what happens is basically you're delegating that task to React. So React knows that this .state will only update its value when there is actually a difference, right? It doesn't update itself every time the component re-renders. So since you're delegating the task to React itself, then the problem here is solved. The other solution is more elegant, I would say, or yeah, I just love hooks. It's using useMemo, which we will look at just in a second, because we are going to look at an entire example using that. Yeah, so let's look at a full flow right now with a full example using hooks. So if anybody doesn't know what a hook is, they would be lost. So please stop me if that's the case. I'll try to give you a 2-3 line definition. Anybody want me to define what a hook is? Great. Okay. So basically what hooks are basically functions which let you access the state, props, context without having to define a class, right? So earlier on, if you had to use state, then you have to convert your functional component to a class component. But then now we use states, we use hooks, which will allow you to, you don't need to do that. So we are kind of moving away from whole class component usage. And also the main thing is, let's take an example, right? Let's say you are subscribing, some event, subscribing to an event and then unsubscribing it, when the component unmounts. So you will be doing this across so many components in your entire application. There is so much redundancy across all your components. Before hooks, there was no way for you to share this logic between components. So hooks provide a way to share the code because it's basically just functions which will allow you to access state. So I don't know if I'm able to explain it in a good way, but I hope at least a little bit it was helpful. So, All right, so let's look at the example right here. So we have, so first of all, we are defining the context once again in a separate file, theme context.js. And then we have our app.js, which in turn returns theme provider and content. Let's take a look at what theme provider and content in turn have. All right, so theme provider uses the state. So it defines it uses the useState hook to define theme and toggle theme. And you use, this is the technique that I was talking about for performance optimization. So you do react.use memo to make sure that only when the theme value actually changes, it will return a new object. So otherwise the value of the value variable remains the same, which is why when you return it, the provider will not read enter. So use memo is just a memoization technique. So that takes care of that. Moving on, you have context.js, which will return theme button. So this is the hierarchy right here. So we saw in app.js, there's a theme provider, which in turn contains a child of content, right? So we saw what theme provider contains, and now we're looking at content, which in turn has a child of a theme button. And just take a look here, we are not passing any props at all to theme button. And inside theme button, we are using the context here. So this is the consumer part right here. So you're doing react.use context of theme context, and we're just destructuring the theme value and the toggle theme from there, and then we're just passing to the button. So we are able to pass the value, the theme and toggle theme at some parent level by using React.provider, context.provider, and then we are able to access it at some nested child level without explicitly passing props. So this is basically what React Context's concept is. So yeah, so React Context has kind of solved that deep prop drilling problem. So one suggestion that I would give you is just make sure you don't overuse React Context API, because that's why I started off with the composition concept. If you look at the official docs as well, that is exactly what Dan Abramov has been like yelling and screaming about. Please don't overuse it. You don't need it for every scenario. There are only when it's really global and you want to broadcast your data across different branches of your component tree, you actually need context. Otherwise, it's simple plain old composition will do the trick for you. So you need to pick the right approach. So yeah, moving on. The burning question: does context replace Redux or not? So what do you all think? No? It depends? Alright, so in order to answer this question, I would say that let's do a self-introspection, right? So let's ask ourselves, why am I using Redux in my app? So how many of you have actually used Redux for any of your apps before? Perfect. So ask yourself, what was the reason you started using Redux? Why did you pick Redux for your particular business case? So what reasons come to your mind? Can any of you share it with me?
Time traveling actually in one application, the longest one I worked for a couple of years.
Awesome.
And it was some of the spec, and it was pretty convenient because also for our workflow. It was a pretty large, vast application. We know that the QA team could just, they encounter a bug, they save a state, they attach the state to the ticket, and we can reproduce exactly that was a lifesaver for us. Sometimes it was not so easy to do this kind of stuff. And on top of that, there is a point that you're missing there, I would also mention. At least until a while ago, say last year or so, another convenient point, I will find that many more people on the market, many more developers. I need also to think in terms of management, not in terms of technical team. If I go to the market and I need some Redux developer, it's easier to find compared to somebody which is already strong and reliable in terms of context. Or at least that was last year. Now I think things are evening out.
Anybody else would like to share? Yes, please.
Thanks. Well, I'm not aware of that. I'm not a developer, I'm a trainer, but our problem with training is that in a week we can't knock up a sizable application. So we need to impress upon people the need for Redux for something like Airbnb. But their code, they're sitting there with a few lines of code and they're thinking this is just extra complexity. So I think it's a question of scale, really.
Okay, so thank you both of you for sharing your views. So that was really helpful, right? So the point of the exercise was to understand what is the decision-making process like how did you go about picking the library, and also to figure out whether it is a replacement for context or not. So let me come to the point, right? So Redux has all these things. It has time traveling, debugging, it provides an awesome middleware which lets you use awesome libraries like sagas. It has dev tools, and when you use it, when you have the React Redux library as well, then it provides a connect function which lets you hook into the global store from any component tree level, which is how the prop drilling problem is getting solved when you use Redux, which is why you don't face that pain when you're actually using Redux. So the list goes on, right? So why I asked you to do this exercise was if the prop drilling, in order to solve the prop drilling problem, if you were predominantly using Redux just for that, and let's say you were not using the time traveling much, you were not using any of the middlewares too much, maybe your app was not that complex, you just jumped on the Redux hype train because it was the cool new thing back then and everybody was using Redux. Trust me, I was one of those people as well, but I just got lucky because it was it turned out to be a complex application which really needed Redux. So yeah, if those were the reasons, right, then yeah, so definitely context is a replacement for Redux. If the only reason why you're using Redux today is getting the benefit of not having to go through the prop drilling problem. If not, if you're genuinely having a use case for using middlewares, if you genuinely making like 10, 20 Ajax calls, from every single page of yours, then you definitely need something like Redux Sagas to manage that. So you need that middleware. You need your dev tools to make sure that you have a seamless debugging experience. So if it's not a complex application and you're just using it for the prop drilling problem, then you may as well just replace it with context. So there's an excellent article by Mark Erickson, who's one of the maintainers of Redux now. He has written this article about Redux is not dead yet. So it's really interesting because off late there have been so many libraries that have been coming out, and every library is like, okay, so now I'm here, so Redux is dead. So it is like GraphQL, there's context, there's suspense, because suspense comes with a cache layer itself. So they were like, oh, we don't need the Redux global store anymore, suspense has cache. Yeah, so GraphQL has its own cache as well. So yeah, every library that's coming out today is like, I'm going to kill Redux, but he has like refuted every single point, and he's like, Redux has its own place, but you just have to be sure that you're picking it for the right reasons. So in summary, I would say don't just, our job as developers when we are picking a tech stack doesn't end with just picking a library or framework. Every decision that we make every single day while coding, it kind of adds up. Whether you're using context, whether you're using component composition, whether you're making sure that you're not succumbing to that performance caveat, everything adds up. So you don't wake up one day and do a benchmark test and realize that, oh my god, my app is taking 8 seconds to load. My time to first byte is like 10 seconds. Oh god, no. So you need to do it like constantly. It's an everyday decisions add up, and that's what results in problems like that, even code maintainability or code quality, performance, whatnot. So I would say just choose your tools wisely. Thank you.